The blizzard had teeth. Seren Vale had heard stories about Kivara Prime's winter storms, how they could strip flesh from bone in minutes, how the indigenous predators waited just beyond the whiteout for anything foolish enough to move. She'd heard them all during the briefing back on the orbital station, delivered by a Centauri surveyor whose mandibles clicked with what might have been amusement. "Humans can't endure there," he'd said, his translator rendering his species equivalent of a chuckle. "Your biology is too fragile, too soft." Now, curled inside the wreckage of her survey pod with a dead heater and failing life support, Seren wondered if he'd been right. The crash had been swift, a micro-meteorite through the starboard thruster, then a spinning descent through Kivara's atmosphere that had rattled her bones and shattered most of her equipment. The distress beacon was working, supposedly, but rescue wouldn't arrive for at least 6 standard days. The automated message had been clear: survive or don't. The temperature inside the pod read -43 degrees Celsius and dropping. Seren's breath came in shallow clouds. Her fingers had gone numb an hour ago despite the thermal gloves. The emergency thermal blanket crinkled around her shoulders, a pathetic shield against the cold that seeped through the hull like water through cloth. Outside, the wind howled with a sound that was almost alive, almost hungry. She was going to die here. The thought came with surprising clarity, without panic. Just a simple statement of fact. Her core temperature was dropping. Hypothermia would claim her before the rescue team even entered the system. The Centauri surveyor would file a report noting that yes, humans were indeed too fragile for Kivara Prime. Case closed. Then she heard the scratching. At first, Seren thought it was ice forming on the hull. But the sound was too rhythmic, too purposeful. Something was outside the pod. Something with claws. Her hand moved instinctively to the plasma cutter, still functional, thank the stars, but her fingers were too stiff to grip it properly. The scratching continued, circling the pod like a predator testing a trap. Seren's heart hammered against her ribs. The access panel shrieked as something forced it open from outside. Cold air flooded in, so brutal it felt like being struck. Seren scrambled backward, plasma cutter finally in hand, finger on the trigger. Through the gap in the panel, she saw eyes, dozens of them, gleaming in the storm's dim light. Yellow, intelligent, watching. Then one of them pushed through. It was massive, easily twice her size, covered in thick silver-white fur that seemed to drink the light. Its face was lupine but broader, more powerful, with fangs that could crush steel. The creature's breath misted in the frigid air as it regarded her with those unsettling yellow eyes. Seren raised the plasma cutter. Her hand shook. From cold or fear, she couldn't tell. The creature tilted its head. Then impossibly it sat. More shapes crowded through the opening, smaller than the first but still formidable. Cubs, Seren realized with a start. 5 of them. Their fur not yet as thick as the adults, their movements playful despite the deadly cold. They tumbled into the pod, bringing snow and the smell of wilderness. The largest cub approached her directly. Unlike the others, this one moved with deliberate purpose, its gaze never leaving hers. There was something ancient in those eyes, something that spoke of intelligence far beyond animal instinct. Seren kept the plasma cutter trained on it, though her resolve was weakening. The cold was eating through her thoughts, making everything fuzzy. The cub, she would later learn his designation, was wrecked, though that knowledge would come much later, stopped just beyond arm's reach. He studied her for a long moment, head cocked as if making some internal calculation. Then he looked back at the adult, released a low, rumbling sound from deep in his chest and turned back to Seren. He lay down beside her. The other cubs followed immediately, arranging themselves around her like living blankets. Their body heat hit her like a wave, so intense after the numbing cold that it almost hurt. Seren gasped, her body instinctively curling toward the warmth even as her mind screamed warnings about predators and teeth and danger. But they didn't bite, didn't attack. They simply pressed closer, their thick fur creating a cocoon of warmth around her shivering frame. Rekt positioned himself directly against her chest, his back to her, his body a furnace. The others filled in the gaps, 2 at her back, 1 at her legs, 1 curled near her head. The adult creature watched from the entrance for a moment longer, then withdrew, sealing the panel partially behind her to block the worst of the wind. Seren's grip on the plasma cutter loosened. The weapon slipped from her numb fingers. The cubs adjusted their positions, pressing tighter. One of them, smaller than Rect with a distinctive notch in her ear, made a soft chittering sound and licked Saran's exposed wrist. The rasp of the tongue was startling but not painful, almost gentle. "You're keeping me warm," Saran whispered, her voice cracked and small in the confined space. "Why?" Rect's ear twitched at the sound of her voice. He didn't turn around, but his breathing slowed, deepened as if he were settling in for a long rest. The message was clear. Sleep. We have you. The warmth continued to build, driving back the lethal cold inch by inch. Sensation returned to Saran's fingers and toes in painful tingles. Her core temperature stabilized. The fog in her thoughts began to clear. They were saving her. These creatures, these apex predators of a world that supposedly couldn't sustain human life, had chosen to keep her alive. Serene's eyes burned. Though whether from cold or emotion, she couldn't say. She tentatively moved one hand, placing it on Rect's back. His fur was impossibly soft beneath the coarse outer layer, and she could feel the steady thrum of his heartbeat. He didn't pull away. The storm raged outside, but inside the ruined pod, surrounded by creatures that shouldn't have cared whether she lived or died, Seren Vale felt warm for the first time since the crash. She pressed her face against Rect's fur and allowed herself to believe she might actually survive this. The Centauri surveyor had been wrong. Humans were fragile. Yes. Soft, certainly. But endurance wasn't just about biology. It was about adaptation. About the unexpected alliances formed in desperate moments. About the stubborn refusal to surrender, even when the universe seemed determined to prove you couldn't survive. And sometimes, it was about the wordless decision of an alpha cub who looked at a dying stranger and thought, "She belongs to the pack now." When rescue finally arrived 6 days later, they found Seren alive and well, surrounded by 7 sleeping Kivaran frost wolves who growled at the approaching team until Seren assured them she was leaving willingly. Rect watched her go with those ancient yellow eyes, and Seren knew, somehow she knew, that she would return. Humans couldn't endure on Kivara Prime, but she just had.